a moment, it was a flash of anger, of realization of what we had gotten ourselves into.
Few bands have left a mark on rock history quite like Heart. Their powerful vocals, shredding guitars, and unforgettable anthems defined a generation. But behind the music, a far more complicated story was unfolding. Ann and Nancy Wilson weren't just bandmates, they were sisters. Their chemistry on stage was undeniable, but off stage, tensions simmered for decades. From breaking barriers in a male-dominated industry to creative struggles and personal differences, their journey was far from smooth. Then, in 2016, a shocking family incident shattered everything, driving an irreparable wedge between them. Tonight, we unravel the story of Heart, the rise, the fractures, and the uncertain future of one of rock's most iconic duos. Is there a path to reconciliation, or is this the final note? Let's find out. Before they became rock legends, Ann and Nancy Wilson were simply two sisters growing up in a world of constant change. Their father was a Marine Corps officer, which meant frequent moves, from California to Taiwan, from Panama to Seattle. For most kids, this kind of instability would be overwhelming. But for the Wilsons, there was one constant: music. Their home was always filled with sound. Their father, a passionate music lover, played everything from grand opera to big band jazz. And their mother, a talented pianist and singer, encouraged the sisters to explore their own musical gifts. Sundays might bring the dramatic crescendos of Beethoven, while weekday nights echoed with the smooth melodies of Ray Charles or the raw energy of early rock and roll. This exposure gave Ann and Nancy a deep, eclectic appreciation for music long before they ever picked up an instrument. But while music was a source of joy, Ann struggled with deep insecurities. She was painfully shy, often feeling like an outsider due to the family's constant relocations. She also developed a severe stutter, which made social interactions even more difficult. Speaking was a challenge, but singing was different. Music gave her a voice, a confidence that everyday conversation could not. When she sang, her words flowed freely, unburdened by hesitation. It was in these moments that she realized music wasn't just something she loved. It was something that made her feel whole. Nancy, on the other hand, found her voice through an instrument. She fell in love with the guitar as a child, captivated by the intricate playing of folk icons like Joni Mitchell and the harmonic brilliance of the Beatles. Determined to master the instrument, she spent hours in her room, teaching herself chords and refining her finger-picking technique. While other kids were out playing, Nancy was locked in a world of melodies and riffs, laying the foundation for what would become her signature style. By the early 1970s, Ann had taken a bold step forward in her musical journey. She joined a local Seattle band called White Heart, a group that played small gigs and local clubs. But this wasn't just another bar band. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Soon after Ann joined, White Heart evolved into something new, simply Heart. The band began gaining momentum, and when Nancy decided to join a few years later, everything clicked into place. With Ann's commanding vocals and Nancy's intricate guitar work, Heart had found its defining sound, a blend of raw rock power and delicate folk melodies. It was unlike anything else at the time, and the chemistry between the sisters became the backbone of the band. In pursuit of bigger opportunities, they made a bold move, relocating to Vancouver, Canada. There, they recorded their debut album, Dreamboat Annie, in 1975. It was an album filled with passion, a reflection of everything they had worked for up to that point. Songs like Magic Man and Crazy on You showcased their unique style, fusing hard rock with acoustic storytelling in a way that was fresh, urgent, and undeniably powerful. When Dreamboat Annie hit the airwaves, it didn't just introduce the world to Heart, it shattered expectations. Female-fronted rock bands were a rarity, and yet, here were two women who weren't just performing. They were leading the charge, writing their own songs, playing their own instruments, and proving that they could rock just as hard as any of their male counterparts. The Wilson sisters had arrived, and while their musical journey was only just beginning, their bond seemed unbreakable. But as time would prove, even the strongest harmonies can hit discordant notes. When Dreamboat Annie hit the airwaves in 1975, Heart became an overnight sensation. Their sound was unlike anything else. Anne's powerhouse vocals and Nancy's intricate guitar work created a fusion of folk, hard rock, and raw emotion that defied the norms of the era. But while their talent was undeniable, their rise to fame wasn't met without resistance. At the time, rock music was still very much a boys' club. Women in the industry were often pushed into pop or folk, rarely taken seriously in hard rock. A female-fronted band that wrote their own songs and played their own instruments? It was almost unheard of. Radio stations hesitated, record labels questioned their marketability, and industry executives constantly tried to mold them into something more palatable, something more conventional. But the Wilson sisters weren't interested in playing by anyone else's rules. In 1977, Heart released Little Queen, an album that cemented their place in rock history. And with it came the song that would define their rebellion, Barracuda. Fueled by rage, Barracuda was a direct response to the industry's blatant sexism. After a record executive falsely implied that Anne and Nancy were in an incestuous relationship to generate press, Anne was furious. That anger poured into the lyrics, turning Barracuda into a ferocious anthem of defiance. The song's relentless guitar riff and Anne's seething vocals weren't just a musical statement. They were a war cry. Heart was here to stay, and they weren't going to be anyone's industry puppet. Despite the pushback, the band's success was undeniable. Hit after hit followed: Crazy on You, Magic Man, and Heartless, each song reinforcing the fact that they were a force to be reckoned with. But with success came even more scrutiny. In interviews from the era, the Wilson sisters spoke candidly about the challenges they faced. They weren't just expected to perform, they were expected to fit a mold. Magazine covers focused on their looks rather than their music. Concert promoters often questioned whether they could headline major tours, and at every turn, they had to fight for the respect that their male counterparts received without question. But while the industry tried to box them in, Heart continued to evolve. As the 80s arrived, rock music was changing. The raw, unfiltered sound of the 70s was making way for something more polished. Big choruses, soaring synthesizers, and stadium-sized production. Heart, always willing to adapt, embraced the shift. In 1985, they released their self-titled album, Heart, marking a dramatic transformation in their sound. Songs like These Dreams and What About Love introduced a more melodic, radio-friendly side of the band. Then came Alone in 1987, a power ballad that became one of their biggest hits. Anne's vocals were nothing short of breathtaking, proving that whether it was hard rock or soaring ballads, Heart could master it all. Some fans saw this evolution as a departure from their roots, but for Heart, it was just another chapter in their journey. Their ability to blend folk-inspired storytelling, hard rock intensity, and emotional depth was what made them unique. They weren't just a band adapting to the times, they were shaping the future of rock itself. By the late 80s, Heart had become one of the biggest rock bands in the world. They had conquered the charts, shattered expectations, and proven time and time again that they belonged on rock's grandest stages. But while their music was harmonious, the pressures of fame, creative tensions, and the weight of expectations would begin to take their toll. And as the 90s approached, the cracks beneath the surface started to widen. As Heart's success soared, so did the demands of fame. The constant grind of touring, recording, and promotion became all-consuming, and the weight of expectation grew heavier with each album. What had started as a shared dream between two sisters was now a massive machine, one that required relentless momentum to keep running. But with that momentum came fractures. Anne and Nancy had always been musically aligned, but as the years went on, their artistic visions began to diverge. Anne, ever the experimentalist, wanted to push the boundaries of their sound, exploring darker, more complex compositions, diving into blues, and evolving beyond the polished rock anthems that had defined their 80s resurgence. Nancy, on the other hand, felt deeply connected to the raw, acoustic-driven roots of their early work. She wanted to preserve the essence of what made Heart special, focusing on the balance of powerful rock and heartfelt storytelling. This creative tug-of-war played out behind the scenes, sometimes in hushed discussions, other times in outright disagreements. Then there was the sheer physical and emotional toll of the lifestyle. The constant cycle of touring left little time for personal lives. Relationships suffered, exhaustion set in, and the never-ending pressure to deliver another hit record became suffocating. There was no time to slow down, no room for mistakes. And beneath it all, the sisters, who had once been inseparable, were starting to drift apart. As the 1990s arrived, the music industry itself was undergoing a seismic shift. Grunge and alternative rock had taken over, and suddenly, the bombastic production and power ballads that had fueled Heart's success in the 80s felt outdated. The band found themselves at a crossroads. Their 1993 album, Desire Walks On, saw moderate success, but it was clear that the industry was moving in a different direction. The raw, angst-driven sounds of bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam dominated the charts, and Heart, once the rebellious newcomers, were now seen as part of an older era of rock. Album sales declined, and the band struggled to maintain their footing. By the mid-90s, the Wilson sisters made a difficult decision: to step back from Heart and explore new paths. Anne ventured into solo work, forming the Ann Wilson Thing, a project that allowed her to experiment with blues and folk influences outside of Heart's usual framework. Nancy, meanwhile, shifted toward film scoring and production, finding a new creative outlet beyond the pressures of the band. For a while, Heart was quiet. Then, in the early 2000s, the sisters reunited for new albums and tours, determined to bring their music back to the stage. But even as they reconnected professionally, the underlying tensions never truly faded. The music industry had changed. Their lives had changed. And, perhaps most importantly, their relationship as sisters had changed. Through it all, they continued to perform together, but the bond that had once been unshakable was now filled with unspoken resentments and unresolved differences. And then, in 2016, everything came to a breaking point. By 2016, Heart was once again a touring force. Their music still resonated, their fans were still loyal, and from the outside, it seemed like the Wilson sisters had overcome the struggles of the past. This tour was supposed to be a celebration, a return to their roots, a chance to remind the world why Heart had endured for so many decades. But behind the scenes, tensions were already simmering. And then, one shocking event shattered everything. It happened on what should have been an ordinary night. After a performance in Auburn, Washington, Nancy's teenage sons, twin boys aged 16, went backstage to visit Anne's new tour bus. Anne's husband, Dean Wetter, was there, and as the boys stepped inside, they unknowingly made a mistake. They left the door open. It seemed trivial, but to Wetter, it was something far more serious. What happened next was swift and violent. According to reports, Wetter snapped. He first slapped one of the boys across the head, then punched him in the back of the skull. When the other twin tried to intervene, Wetter turned on him, grabbing him by the throat and squeezing until the boy struggled for air. It wasn't just an argument, it was an attack. Terrified, the boys rushed for help, and soon the police were involved. Wetter was arrested that night and charged with assault. The incident sent shockwaves through the Wilson family. But the most devastating fallout wasn't just legal, it was personal. For Nancy, the attack on her children was inexcusable. She expected Anne to stand with her, to condemn what had happened, to recognize the severity of the situation. But Anne didn't see it that way. Instead of distancing herself from Wetter, she defended him, claiming that the incident had been exaggerated, that it should have been handled privately within the family, rather than escalated to the authorities. To Nancy, this was an unimaginable betrayal. Almost overnight, the sisters' relationship disintegrated. They were no longer just bandmates with creative differences. They were family members on opposite sides of an irreparable divide. The remainder of the tour became a tense, almost unbearable experience. For the first time in their careers, Anne and Nancy operated as completely separate entities. They traveled in different vehicles, stayed in separate hotels, and refused to speak directly to each other. Even their dressing rooms were placed far apart, and all communication was filtered through third parties. On stage, they maintained a professional front, smiling just enough, interacting just enough to convince the audience that everything was fine. But those who had followed Heart for years could sense that something was deeply wrong. And as the final notes of the tour rang out, it became painfully clear. The connection that had once defined Heart was gone. The Wilson sisters had spent their entire lives making music together. Now, for the first time, they weren't sure if they ever would again. After the 2016 incident, Anne and Nancy Wilson found themselves standing at a crossroads. For the first time in decades, Heart wasn't just on hiatus. It was broken. Their once unshakable bond as sisters and bandmates had been fractured, and neither seemed willing to mend it. As the dust settled, the Wilson sisters each embarked on separate musical paths. Anne, looking for a fresh start, turned inward. She formed the Anne Wilson Thing, a solo project that allowed her to explore music on her own terms. Stripping away the expectations that came with Heart, she embraced a raw, blues-inspired sound. Covering classic rock, soul, and folk songs, her voice took center stage in a way that felt more intimate, more personal. She was no longer chasing chart success. She was making music for herself. Meanwhile, Nancy took a different approach. Rather than stepping away from Heart's legacy, she leaned into it. She formed Nancy Wilson's Heart, a touring band that kept the spirit of the group alive. Performing the band's most iconic songs with a new lineup of musicians, she made it clear that if Anne wouldn't carry the torch, she would. For fans, this division was bittersweet. They still had the music, but the magic of seeing the Wilson sisters together on stage had disappeared. And despite their separate ventures, the question lingered. Was this the end of Heart? Then, in 2019, an announcement sent shockwaves through the rock world. Heart was reuniting for the Love Alive tour. It seemed like a dream come true for longtime fans. After years of silence and speculation, Anne and Nancy would be back on stage together, performing the songs that had defined their careers. The tour was met with excitement and anticipation, a hopeful sign that the rift between them had healed. But behind the scenes, things weren't as simple as they seemed. Yes, Heart was back, but the sisterhood that had once fueled the band was still missing. Unlike past tours, where they had shared dressing rooms, travel arrangements, and late-night jam sessions, this time, everything was separate. They had different crews, different tour buses, different schedules. Every interaction was carefully managed, every detail planned to keep personal conflicts from resurfacing. On stage, they played their roles well, harmonizing perfectly, trading smiles, giving the audience what they came for. But those closest to them knew the truth. This wasn't a reunion of two sisters mending their relationship. It was a business arrangement, a carefully orchestrated performance for the sake of the music and the fans. And as the final show of the tour wrapped up, one thing became painfully clear. Heart wasn't fully back. The music remained, but the deep connection that had once held Ann and Nancy together was still lost. And perhaps it always would be. As the years have passed, Ann and Nancy Wilson have remained deeply committed to their music, but not to each other. Heart, once a symbol of their unbreakable bond, now exists only in legacy. The idea of a true reunion, of the Wilson sisters standing side by side once again, seems more distant than ever. But that hasn't stopped them from forging ahead in their own ways. For Ann, stepping away from Heart has meant stepping into complete creative control. No longer bound by the expectations of a band known for arena rock anthems and radio-friendly hits, she has leaned into the music that has always spoken to her the most. Deep, soulful, blues-infused rock. In 2022, she released Fierce Bliss, a solo album that was raw, emotional, and unapologetically personal. The album blended classic rock influences with a modern edge, featuring collaborations with artists like Vince Gill and members of Gov't Mule. It wasn't just another album, it was a statement, a declaration that Ann Wilson was still very much an artist in her own right. Critics praised Fierce Bliss for its depth, calling it one of the most passionate records of her career. Fans, too, embraced it, recognizing that Ann was no longer trying to recreate Heart's success. She was carving out something entirely her own. Her live performances reflect this shift. Instead of massive stadium tours, Ann has opted for smaller, more intimate venues where she can connect with the audience on a deeper level. Her set lists feature a mix of Heart classics, reimagined covers of rock and blues standards, and her own newer material. Gone are the massive productions and elaborate stage setups. Now, it's all about the music, the storytelling, the emotion. For Ann, this is the most free she has ever felt as an artist. But for longtime Heart fans, it's bittersweet. Because as Ann moves forward, the possibility of a true Heart reunion seems to fade further into the past. While Ann has embraced reinvention, Nancy has taken a different approach. Instead of moving away from Heart's legacy, she has fully embraced it, determined to keep the band's music alive, even without Ann by her side. In 2021, Nancy released You and Me, her first official solo album. It was a deeply personal project, featuring stripped-down, acoustic-driven songs that showcased her signature playing style. The album was dedicated to her late mother, and its introspective, heartfelt nature resonated with fans who had followed her journey for decades. But Nancy knew that fans still longed to hear the songs that made Heart legendary. So she formed Nancy Wilson's Heart, a new touring lineup that allowed her to bring Heart's music back to the stage. With a talented group of musicians backing her, she began performing the band's greatest hits: Barracuda, Crazy on You, Magic Man, Alone, giving audiences a taste of what once was. For many, it was the closest they would ever get to experiencing a real Heart concert again. Nancy has made it clear that she isn't trying to replace what she and Ann had. She's simply keeping the spirit of Heart alive. And in a way, she has succeeded. Fans still pack venues to hear those iconic songs, still sing along to every word, still hold on to the hope that one day, both Wilson sisters will share the stage again. But will that ever happen? The reality is, there are no clear signs of true reconciliation. While both Anne and Nancy have been careful with their public statements, those closest to them say the wounds of 2016 have never fully healed. Anne has remained steadfast in her support of her husband, refusing to acknowledge that his actions were the true breaking point. Nancy, on the other hand, has made it clear that what happened to her children was unforgivable. And then, there's the matter of their artistic visions. Even before their personal fallout, Anne and Nancy had been moving in different creative directions. Anne had long wanted to push Heart's sound into new, more experimental territory, while Nancy preferred to honor their original style. This tension existed for years, but after 2016, it became yet another reason for their separation. Their 2019 Love Alive tour was the closest they came to a reunion, but even then, it was strictly business. Separate dressing rooms, separate travel arrangements, minimal interaction beyond what was required on stage. It was a reunion in name only. On the surface, a celebration of Heart's music, but underneath, a reminder that the bond that once held them together was now just a memory. So, what does the future hold? Could they ever put aside their differences for one final tour? One last album? A true reconciliation that allows them to close this chapter together, not apart? For now, the answer remains uncertain. Heart has never officially disbanded, but it has also never truly come back together. Anne and Nancy continue to exist in separate musical worlds, each thriving in their own way, but forever linked by the music they created together. Fans continue to hope. Some believe that time will heal old wounds, that eventually the weight of their shared history will bring them back together. Others believe that the damage is too deep, that too much has been said, too much has been left unsaid. What is clear is this: whether together or apart, the Wilson sisters have already cemented their place in rock history. Heart's music will always be celebrated. Their influence will always be felt, and their story will continue to captivate audiences for generations to come. But as for Anne and Nancy themselves, only time will tell if the music that once united them can ever bring them back together again. Through decades of triumphs, struggles, and reinvention, Heart has carved out a legacy that few bands can match. Their music broke barriers, redefined rock, and inspired generations of artists. Even with the drama, the Wilson sisters' impact on music is undeniable. But as the years pass, one question remains. Will Anne and Nancy ever find their way back to each other? Is there still a chance for a true Heart reunion? Or have they closed that chapter forever? What do you think? Can time heal their wounds? Or is this the final note in their shared story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into rock history, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories on the legends of music. No matter what the future holds, one thing is certain: Heart's music will live on forever.